Greetings to you all at Tokyo Metropolitan University. My name is Glenn Denning. I work in the areas of agriculture, food security, and sustainable development. I am a professor of practice at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. I'm also the director of Columbia's MPA in Development Practice program. Prior to coming to Columbia in 2009, I worked in Asia and Africa for more than 30 years. It is a real pleasure and an honor for me to share some of that experience with you today through the Global Lecture Series. So first of all, what I'd like to do is share some slides with you. Let's begin. Right, so the title of my lecture today is Sustainable Development, the SDGs, and the Quest for Universal Food Security. I will present this material in four parts. Firstly, Sustainable Development and the SDGs. In part two, I will discuss food security in historical perspective. Part three, I will introduce a topic that I call universal food security. And part four will be about implementation and leadership in relation to food security. So to part one, sustainable development and the SDGs. I think for this audience, I don't need to go over in great detail the significance of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I know that this was covered a few months ago by my director and mentor and colleague, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, in one of the lecture series topics, Sustainable Development, the Future We Want. So I'll just go over a few of the major points, but I do suggest that all of you interested in sustainable development and the SDGs should take a close look at that lecture that was given a few months ago. So the basic idea is that in 2015, we moved to a new global framework known as the 2030 Agenda, encapsulated by 17 SDGs. We transitioned from the previous framework, which were the Millennium Development Goals, which was the overarching development framework for the period 2000 to 2015. So the new period, the SDGs, began 2015, now headed towards 2030, roughly halfway towards the target date for those goals. So in summary, how do the SDGs differ from the MDGs? Well, first of all, there are more of them, 17 goals, 169 targets, and more than 200 unique indicators. The SDGs are more comprehensive in that they include aspects of economic prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. There are several explicit goals that were not articulated in the MDGs, such as related to governance, related to inequality, industrial development, responsible production, consumption, and of course, SDG 13 related to climate. The SDGs, I think it could be said, were more participatory in how they were developed and meant to be more participatory in how they are implemented and in the review process. In other words, it's more than simply governments taking the lead in this process. And importantly, there was a significant change in that the SDGs were meant to have an element of universality in the sense that we were now all accountable. It was no longer a case of rich countries being concerned about poor countries and focusing their efforts only on poor countries. With the SDGs, we all have issues related to economic, social, and environmental dimensions of development, and therefore we're all accountable for achieving those goals. So far, roughly halfway towards 2030, I think there have been some encouraging signs. The SDGs being increasingly adopted by governments and international organizations, including the multilateral development banks, including Japan, very much involved in incorporating SDGs into various government frameworks and being promoted widely within society here. The SDGs are also reflected in corporate commitments related to environment, social and governance investing, ESG investing. And we find that there's a growing range of different constituencies that are beginning to recognize the SDGs as a guiding framework for their programs. There's also been in recent years a proliferation of indices and scorecards that enable organizations, including governments and multilateral organizations, to monitor the progress they're making towards the SDGs. And in summary, really, this all should not be very surprising, because it's very difficult for any of us to question the need for any of the 17 SDGs. So, having said that, I think it's important at this point to take a few cautionary notes related to the SDGs. And I think the first one is that although all goals are indeed important, they are not equally important everywhere. And for that reason, priorities have to be set. Secondly, we see a lot of mapping and alignment going on, but that should not be seen as a substitute for doing things differently and stepping up efforts. Thirdly, I think we should be skeptical about well-intentioned but sometimes flimsy and unrealistic indicators and indices of progress. And I think we should also look out for what I call fixation errors, where practitioners sometimes focus on a single aspect of development, on a single SDG, to the detriment of others, not recognizing sometimes the trade-offs that are necessary and the complementarities that are necessary to achieve development progress. So here we are at roughly the midpoint of implementation of the 2030 agenda, and it's important to reflect and recommit ourselves to the SDGs. There will be a summit in September of 2023 that will take a hard look and review the state of the SDGs. It's important that at this time to respond to some of the crises that we've been facing in recent years, and to see and re-examine the importance and relevance, the need for re-energizing our efforts in view of COVID, in view of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and a global economic recession. So this particular meeting in September will also be there to provide high-level political guidance on different actions that are needed, and in particular, take a look at the financial needs. And one area where finance is going to be needed urgently is in food security. Food security, which is the primary focus of my talk today, is both a prerequisite for and an outcome of geopolitical stability and sustainable development. So, food security, I would argue, is the most fundamental and most important outcome of our global food system. But what exactly is food security? Why do we use this term security? Now, I go straight to a textbook definition of security: the state of being free from danger or threat. So think about it as that. The state of being free from the danger or threat of being without food. Not any food, but healthy, nutritious food, so that we can live a healthy and productive life. Food is important. Josette Chiran, who was the former executive, is the former executive director of the World Food Program, made this comment: there's nothing more basic than food. If people don't have it, one of three things happen: they revolt, they migrate, or they die. So we've seen from time to time through history, when people are deprived of food, all manner of actions take place, including violence in the streets, particularly in urban areas. But what we don't often see are the effects of hunger and malnutrition on human development, on a process that becomes manifested as stunting, where our brains are affected. It stunts our body, our brains, and our immunity systems, and creates long-term negative impacts on education and human development and livelihoods. So for that reason, SDG 2, Zero Hunger, one of the SDGs, is dedicated specifically to this area. And it covers a wide range, including, this is the wording of it is to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So it covers everything from hunger, food security, nutrition, and agriculture itself. There are 8 targets and 14 indicators under SDG 2. I'll just mention 4 of these. Target 2.1, by 2030, end hunger and ensure food access by all people. End hunger and ensure food access by all people. Target 2.2, by 2030, end all forms of malnutrition, both undernutrition and what's sometimes called overnutrition, the overweight and obesity epidemic that we're seeing in the world today. Target 2.3, by 2030, double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. There are more than 400 million small-scale food producers in the world, and they contribute roughly 1/3 of the food that's produced and consumed in the world today. Target 2.4, by 2030, ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices. So these are some of the these are 4 of the targets that are part of this SDG 2 on zero hunger. Now, there has been 2 years ago a UN conference, a food systems summit in 2021 to re-examine the progress that's being made. I think there was a sense that some progress is made, but at that time, of course, in the throes of COVID and climate change and other stresses and shocks to the system, there was a sense that we could be doing much, much more. And it was frankly unlikely that we were going to achieve SDG 2 by 2030. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, declared, we don't need any new goals. We simply need to move boldly now to implement the transformative actions needed to achieve the goals we have. So we have SDG 2, we have very clear goals on hunger and food security and nutrition and sustainable agriculture. We really need to move forward because, as he said, food systems hold the power to realize our shared vision for a better world. So let me now move from the SDGs and let's just go back in time a little bit. I'd like to put food security through historical perspective. And this means going back literally as many as 10,000 years. 10,000 years before the present, humanity were hunters and gatherers. So we obtained our food by moving around, by collecting food and consuming food. That changed around 10,000 years ago with the changing climate, and we moved towards a new system of settled agriculture. And as you can see here, that has greatly diverged over the years. Smallholder farming, subsistence farming was dominant and still is dominant in many parts of the world, but it has also been replaced by higher technology, industrialized agriculture, as illustrated by the photograph on this screen from Brazil, mechanical harvesting of soybeans in South America. And our food system is really in such a way that we can go into supermarkets and access food if we have the resources, if we have the money, we can access food produced all over the world. In fact, 56% of us now live in cities in the world. So 56% of the world's population really have little or nothing to do with the production of that food. And it's created, in many ways, great success in terms of those of us who are privileged enough to be able to enjoy access to such a wide diversity and quality of food. At the same time, we have a food crisis. We still have a situation where hundreds of millions of people around the world are not getting enough food, are undernourished. And these are often the result of conflicts, sometimes the result of climate disasters, of droughts and floods and the like. But we have a very unequal world in terms of accessibility to food. So if we look at the population, when I said we were hunters and gatherers 10,000, 12,000 years ago, the population then, the population on the planet was anywhere from about sort of 4 million to 10 million, literally a tiny, not even the size of Tokyo, was the entire population of the planet. Let's move forward now to 2023. In fact, November 2022, we passed 8 billion. So we've gone from around 4 to 10 million to 8 billion in the past 10,000 years. So this obviously puts a lot of stress on our planet, in our ability to feed those people well. Now, we're not the first generation to talk about this. Thomas Malthus, in 1798, in his classic publication, An Essay on the Principle of Population, referred to what he said was a natural inequality of the forces of population and food production. And you can see in this graphical representation here that the world's population was increasing exponentially. At the same time, production of food was only increasing on a linearly, and you can see what happens when the two lines cross, and that is this idea of a Malthusian catastrophe. Okay, so think of it again. Like all populations, human populations have increased exponentially, but at least up until the last century or so, expansion of food production was simply based on increasing the area of production. So you expand the land frontier in order to increase food production. Sooner or later, you will run out of land to produce the population if you take that strategy. Now, Malthus warned of a gigantic inevitable famine. So what his solutions were to moderate demand. And he didn't talk about the production side of things. He said, basically, we have to do something about population. So moderating demand through birth control, through postponement of marriage, and through celibacy. So let's take another look at that diagram of the world population increasing exponentially. And just imagine that it very much appears that they didn't pay any notice to Malthus's recommendations, because indeed population continued to grow. In fact, when Malthus published his famous essay, the world population was around 1 billion. Now, as I mentioned, it is 8 billion plus and growing. And we anticipate at least, the world population to be approaching 10 billion by 2050. So I'm not the first person to talk about it. Malthus was one of the earlier prophets who basically had the view that we need to deal with population. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were definitely fears within Asia of overpopulation relative to the resources and relative to the food supplies. There were famines occurring, major food shortages across Asia, and fears were rising of what Malthus had warned us, this natural inequality between population and food supply. And this was really in the 1950s and 1960s. In fact, in 1968, a book was written by William and Paul Paddock, which they called Famine 1975. They predicted a famine. they said the world will be unable to feed the population by 1975. And they were of the view that the only way people could survive this would be through food aid, through the generosity of, in this case, American food surpluses. At that point, the United States was one of the only nations generating sufficient surpluses of food beyond its own domestic requirements to be able to support other countries with their food security. And these authors, they came up with that categorization of different countries. And the three categories were as follows. You can see at the top of the page there. Category 1 was can't be saved. Category 2 was the walking wounded. And category 3 was should receive food. And they went about their work in this book, and they classified the different countries according to whether they could be saved, whether they were walking wounded, or whether they should receive food aid. And I think it's a very interesting historical point that they decided that India can't be saved. And why it's so interesting is that, in fact, India last year, or in the last few years, has been the largest exporter of rice in the world. In fact, it approached 20 million tons, I think 2 years ago, 20 million tons of exports. So, in fact, India could be saved. In fact, India, and I'll explain in a minute, was able to address the production side of the equation as well as population, but not to the same extent as, say, China. China's not mentioned here, but we can see that many countries did not necessarily, thankfully, did not follow the practice of simply hoping that population would solve the problem. They worked on improving agricultural productivity. And the person more than anyone who was responsible for this was Dr. Norman Borlaug. Now, Dr. Norman Borlaug was a wheat scientist who developed new high-yielding wheat varieties. He developed those varieties in Mexico through a very interesting and innovative approach, which he called shuttle breeding. So he developed these new high-yielding disease-resistant wheat varieties. And those seeds were successful in Mexico, but then they were taken to India and Pakistan, spread among farmers, and very quickly wheat production in those areas responded. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the first agricultural scientist to ever win, and I believe the only one to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. And he's regarded as or is called the father of the Green Revolution. Now, it wasn't restricted only to wheat. See, across Asia, there are two major staple foods, wheat and rice. And many would consider rice even more important than wheat in terms of how central it is to food security, to culture, and to the economies of most countries across Asia. And certainly, historically, it's been extremely important in Japan. So around the time that Professor Borlaug was doing his work on wheat, the International Rice Research Institute, also known as IRRI, was established in 1960 in the Philippines, in a town, Los Baños, about 70 kilometers south of Manila. I had the great pleasure to work at IRRI for almost 20 years, between 1980 and 1998. And I wanted to use this opportunity to also mention with this audience that I managed to work with some wonderful Japanese scientists who were part of the IRRI scientific team. You can see there on the left, Dr. Shuichi Yoshida. He was our plant physiologist, a rice physiologist. He wrote a magnificent book called Fundamentals of Rice Crop Science. I learned so much from Dr. Yoshida about the actual physiology of how rice grows. Incredibly important understanding, and he played a major role in it really having introducing some of the sort of foundational physiological research that led to the Green Revolution. Another scientist I worked with very closely was Dr. Iwao Watanabe. He was a soil microbiologist. He worked on many microbiological ways in which nitrogen, the most important nutrient for rice, could be added to the soil. One of those was azolla, which was a fern. It was a symbiotic relationship between a fern and blue-green algae. And I worked closely with Dr. Watanabe in field testing azolla in different situations in the Philippines and elsewhere in Asia. And the third person that I worked closely with was Kajiro Otsuka. He is an economist and has done outstanding work. And any of you who are interested in the Green Revolution, the history of the Green Revolution and progress and the economics and impact and consequences, Dr. Otsuka, Professor Otsuka, had some wonderful research on that, not only in Asia, but also looking at Africa as well. So 3 of these Japanese scientists I worked with at IRRI over my 20 years that I had the pleasure of working there. So the main thing to come out of IRRI were really these high-yielding rice varieties. IR8 was known as the miracle rice variety, and it spread far and wide throughout Asia. It was released in 1966 in the Philippines. It was a hybrid. It was a cross between 2 traditional varieties, or one traditional variety from Indonesia known as Peta, and a variety from Taiwan, Dijia Wujen, a short variety with a tall variety. You ended up with this intermediate stature with very responsive to fertilizers and improved conditions. And we saw rice yields dramatically increase across Asia. It attracted the attention of many, not least, you can see this second on the right on your screen is President Marcos, the father of the present President Marcos in the Philippines. And he certainly promoted the role of rice technology. He was famous for promoting rice and roads as a development strategy. And it even attracted the likes of President Lyndon Baines Johnson from the United States, who visited IRRI in 1966 and had his sights on how rice technologies could also advance the interests of the United States in the Vietnam War at that time. We know the history of that, and it did not succeed in that sense. But what I will say is that those varieties did reach Vietnam, and Vietnam emerged after the war as a major rice exporter and continues to be one to this day. So that's really the story of IRRI, but you had both the rice and the wheat as the major cereals being promoted by governments, the seeds, increased fertilizer use, increase the spread of investment on irrigation, infrastructure, particularly roads and storage facilities, various forms of government policies that were instrumental, credit and extension, and of course, national political leadership was an important part of all of this. Without the national political leadership, none of this would happen. So many of the governments across Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and elsewhere, were promoting the idea of food security through increased domestic production and self-sufficiency. So the impact of this, what we saw was that cereal production, rice and wheat together, doubled between 1970 and 1995. The population increased by 60%. So here we have a situation where production moved ahead faster than population. The area that was planted actually only increased by 4%. The cultivated area increased by just 4%. So what we really saw was an intensification of production. Poverty was reduced, levels of hunger were reduced over this period, and this became what became known as the engine of structural transformation of the economies. And the irony of all this was that agriculture, through its improved productivity, was able to become so efficient that it generated various surpluses of food and eventually surpluses of labor, so that in fact the service and manufacturing sectors of the economies grew even faster than agriculture. So over time, agriculture supported the advancement of manufacturing and service industries. So that was good for the overall economy. So an important beneficiary that many people don't realize and many people don't think about in terms of the Green Revolution was it actually reduced the real price of food. So urban workers who were working in manufacturing and services could purchase more food with their incomes. And this actually in turn made it possible for export industries in Asia to be more competitive globally. So that was the role of Asia's Green Revolution. So there were, it wasn't all rosy in that sense. Despite these incredible advances in terms of food security across Asia in particular, it's fair to say that hunger and malnutrition persisted in many areas, and including in South Asia. Even though India emerged as an exporter of food, the fact is that still about a third of Indian children are malnourished. And this is what's called the South Asia enigma. So it basically says that production isn't everything. You also need to have access, and you need to be able to utilize those additional nutrients that come from agricultural production. It's true also that the progress was quite slow in Africa, was very much delayed, but it's not as slow as some people think. And I will show you later the impact of Africa's own uniquely African Green Revolution and the effect that's having on production in that continent. It's true also that there's been a growth in the prevalence of overweight and obesity and related non-communicable diseases across the world. So there's the other side of the nutrition spectrum, and that is essentially overnutrition. There have been issues related to natural resource degradation and climate change, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. There's been proportionally less benefit going to women. Women have, it's been shown that they've had less access than men to agricultural assets and inputs and services such as credit and extension. And I think we should not lose sight of the fact that the population has not stopped growing. As I said earlier, we do expect that the population will likely grow from around 8 billion to around 9.7, approaching 10 billion people by 2050, perhaps increasing to 11 billion by the end of the century. People's incomes are increasing, their diets are changing associated with urbanization, and of course, we do see that food security is vulnerable to shocks, including climate change and including pandemics, as we saw with COVID-19. So this graph shows you real food prices across a period from 1961 to around 2022. You will see a few peaks there. The food crisis in the early to mid 70s. Then you'll see a fairly long period where food prices declined, and that was that period roughly between about the mid 1970s through to the turn of the century, to around 2000. Real food prices went down, and as I said, this had played an important role in terms of improving people's real incomes and improving competitiveness of exports across Asia. And then we've seen some spikes since then with the food crisis, 2007, 2008, which really continued on to about 2012, then with the COVID-19 pandemic, then with the Ukraine crisis. It's dropped back a little bit from what you can see on the graph there, but it's still, the food price in the world today is still 50% higher than it was before the 2007 food crisis. So for the last 15, 16 years, we've been operating on higher food prices, and that brings with it many, many challenges, such that the World Food Programme, which is the main UN humanitarian organization focused on food, sent out a red alert last year, earlier this year, I believe it was, describing what we're experiencing right now as a global food crisis like no other. So the combination of climate, of COVID, of now conflict in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war, all of these things have come together to create a major global food crisis. So that is the history that I hope is useful in providing a kind of a platform for you to think about what can be done today. We're here in 2023. What can be done about food security today? Now, not entirely leaving the historical perspective, I wanted to now introduce the term universal food security. And why universal? Why am I using this term universal? The reason is that universal refers to every person, means reaching every person on this planet with food security. And that idea is very much founded in the idea that food is a human right. The UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 mentioned food. The International Covenant of 1966, the UN International Covenant, was even more specific about food security as being a human right. In 1996, there was a World Food Summit where food security was really defined as access to food for all people at all times. So food security means all people at all times. And of course, the 2030 agenda and the SDGs had this very important idea that they put at the front, very front and center of the 2030 agenda, and that would be no one will be left behind. So for all these reasons, we should be focusing on the importance, the universality of food security. And for that reason, I have defined universal food security as a world where every person enjoys a healthy diet derived from sustainable food systems. So think of these three components, right? Every person, no one left behind, healthy diets, not any diet, but a healthy diet, and that diet would be derived from food produced and distributed in sustainable food systems. So the question, have we made progress? What progress have we made towards universal food security? Now, I'm going to share with you two aspects. Firstly, a nutrition scorecard. So we'll put up this scorecard and see how well have we performed in terms of meeting universal food security. Well, it's not very pretty to look at. Let me begin with hungry. 800 million people are hungry. So 1 in 10 people on the planet are energy deprived. So that's a definition of hungry according to the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's basically a minimum number of calories, right? 800 million people. More than 2 billion people across the planet suffer micronutrient deficiencies of various kinds. So it could be iron or vitamin A or zinc or folate or iodine. 2 billion people plus. 150 million children under the age of 5 are stunted. So 1 in 5 children are stunted. Their brains are affected. Their educational opportunities are reduced. And ultimately, their livelihoods and income generation opportunities are reduced. 50 million children under the age of 5 are wasted. Means they're basically underweight for their height, and they've wasted away essentially. 1 in 10, right? So these folks, these children under the age of 5 are at risk of death, a much greater risk of death than had they not been wasted. We now have the most recent numbers would indicate that more than 2.5 billion people on the planet are overweight, and 1/3 of them are in the obese category. 3 billion people, according to the UN, cannot afford a healthy diet. So if you put all this together, as I said, it's not a pretty sight. The conclusion I draw from all this is that around 4 billion people are consuming a less than healthy diet. So that's half of the population on the planet are consuming too little or too much. Now, that's not enough. The food system also has an environmental footprint, and the food system is contributing to deforestation and forest degradation. The food system is contributing to land degradation, to erosion, nutrient depletion. It's contributing to unsustainable water extraction. 70% of the fresh water that is extracted by humans goes to agriculture, 70%. We see soil, water, and air pollution as a result of our food systems, where we've had unprecedented biodiversity loss, often associated with deforestation, but also aquatic losses of biodiversity. And importantly, we have the food system contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, right? So those greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, the food system, and I'm talking about the totality of the food system. That's the agriculture, that's the processes that go on, the land clearing and the like, and the transport involved, the food waste, all aspects of the food system. You put it all together, it contributes 1/3 of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, 1/3. Okay, that's the latest figures that are available, and with all the important recognition of the importance of energy and renewable energy, we should also remember that food is part of the issue, and therefore it is potentially part of the solution as well. So 3-4 years ago, I began working on this, trying to assemble as much information as I could. I recently came out with a book entitled Universal Food Security: How to End Hunger While Protecting the Planet. The reason I wrote this book was I was searching for best practice. It wasn't entirely clear to me how we deal with this incredible challenge that we have before us. I relied on peer-reviewed literature and expert opinion, more than 650 references, and enormous benefit from hundreds of colleagues and other experts around the world who've contributed their ideas to this book. The whole philosophy that I've followed in writing about this is that it's science, context, needs, and rights, not ideology, that must shape our decisions on policies and practices. So it's very much evidence-based, okay, not ideological at all. But I have to confess that in the end, I have to make a call, and this is my take on what's required to achieve a food secure world, and that's what I'd like to share with you in the remaining part of this talk. So, the conclusion I drew from all of these, all the literature, the task forces, the commissions, the consultations, and so on, was that really there were 5 big areas that we needed to invest in. I call it the big 5 areas, in order to achieve a food system that is productive, profitable, inclusive, healthy, sustainable, resilient, and ethical. So they were the demands, they were the boundaries. We needed a food system that met those requirements. And I came up with 5 specific areas within the food system, and then a number of other cross-cutting factors that not only affected the food system, but also other systems as well. But those 5 areas were sustainable intensification, which is essentially producing more food with, excuse me, more food with reduced environmental footprint. Okay, so this is intensification of food production, but doing so in a sustainable way. Secondly, market infrastructure. So the idea is just connecting farms to markets much more efficiently through roads, through other transportation systems, through information and technology systems, and through policies and programs. Post-harvest stewardship recognized that we're losing about 1/3 of the food that we produce, we don't end up consuming. We lose it or waste it along the way. So policies and interventions and technologies and programs that can reduce those losses and waste. Healthy diets, shifting towards healthier and more sustainable diets. And the 5th area was social protection. So this is really for people who are not really in the marketplace, people for whom the markets don't work. And these are folks who need support from governments and non-government organizations in order to meet their food security requirements. So I'll very briefly touch each of these points in my final 10 minutes or so here. Firstly, a good question to ask, and I'm sure many of you have been thinking that. Do we really need more food? Don't we have enough food? Isn't it just a matter of redistributing the food that we have? The answer is, well, no, we do need more food. We do need more food. And there's all manner of studies have been done on this, and it's not entirely clear how much more food we need, but I've not seen a single study that convinced me that we can simply operate with the production systems that we currently have. We will need more food, but we'll have to produce that food much more smartly than we have in the past. And you really have 2 choices. The choices are simple. You can extensify or you can intensify. So we can go and clear more land, or we can produce more on the land that we currently have. So it's useful to take a look at crop land per capita in the world and look at the trends over time. So take a look at this, this map of the world, the green areas, the bright green areas. This is cropland per capita. In 1961, cropland per capita was less than half a hectare. So that means half a hectare produced the food for 1 person. In 2021, it was 0.24 of a hectare. So basically almost half of that level produced the food for the world population at that time. And it's expected by 2050 to decrease to about 0.2 of a hectare. So unless we choose to expand our agricultural frontier, we have to intensify production and grow more on existing land. So what I have said is to look at it as a process in aggregate. So I'm not suggesting that sustainable intensification means we go to every farm on the planet and work out a way to intensify and produce more. That doesn't make sense, actually. However, there are different components we can put together such that in aggregate, when we look overall to our agricultural footprint, we can produce more, but with overall less of an environmental impact. We can increase output on existing lands through increasing use of external inputs. Now, there's many parts of the world, and I would focus sharply on sub-Saharan Africa, where we are not using sufficient external inputs. I often refer to sub-Saharan Africa as agriculture there is an extractive industry. We're basically taking nutrients out of the farms and not replacing them. So increased use of external inputs to make agriculture more sustainable. Maintaining current levels of farm output, but becoming much more efficient with our input use. Probably some parts of Asia where we've probably gone too high in terms of our input use. We need to cut back on input use, be much more efficient, use technologies such as precision agriculture to be much more efficient in that way. We can restore land that's been abandoned or has become unproductive through very strategic use of external inputs. But I would also add that some agricultural areas we simply need to abandon. We need to walk away from them. Some unproductive lands, we really need to go out of cropping into other enterprises, perhaps back to the natural environment, perhaps to grazing, perhaps to tree planting and the like, alternative enterprises to crop production. We should also reduce our post-harvest losses because at the end of the day, what we're looking for is net food supply from our land. So if we're wasting 1/3 of the food, then it doesn't make any sense to be expanding our land frontier. We need to be much more efficient in terms of what we actually use from the food that we produce in our land. And finally, we need to find ways to protect what remaining natural ecosystems that there are, ensure that that they're valued and that the people with those resources are compensated for their environmental services. The end result of all this is producing more food with a reduced environmental footprint. So it's these multiple components coming together as sustainable intensification. Cambodia is a country that I've been closely associated with for a long time. Rice production in Cambodia has increased from since the time of the war, the Vietnam War, the spillover into Cambodia, the period of the Khmer Rouge, where production went down to only 500,000 tons of rice in 1 year. It has increased now to 10-11 million tons. There's been an intensification of production through external inputs. The country has emerged as a small but significant exporter of high quality rice. So intensification has been very much a part of all that. The case of Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa, a similar case in some ways without the conflict, but in this case, it was the effect of weather and climatic variation that encouraged the government to step up and begin a farm input subsidy program in 2005. And since 2005, in all but 3 years, the country has generated a net surplus of food above its national food requirements. So again, intensification. Malawi is a country, there's very little opportunity to expand the actual area of land dedicated to agriculture. In the case of Malawi, it was maize. In the case of Cambodia, it was rice, of course. It comes at a cost. Inputs, when you're a landlocked country far from the coast, farmers basically would be paying a very high price to improve their fertility, to purchase fertilizers. So the government, and with the support of some donors, have been able to step up and support the country to achieve a reasonable level of food security. Much more needs to be done, but I think I would still highlight Malawi as an example of a country that was able to step up and address the issue of food security through intensification. If we compare Africa and Asia, and again, you might find this as a little bit of a surprise, this figure from my book, if you see the line at the bottom ending in 62%, this basically shows the Green Revolution, the Asian Green Revolution from its beginning in 1966 up till 1981. Production of cereals increased by 62% over that 15-year period. When you look at sub-Saharan Africa and you take the beginning of the African Green Revolution as 2004, which was when Kofi Annan declared the need for a uniquely African Green Revolution, and the Malawi program began at that time, and several other countries were intensifying their production. You see that actual cereal production in sub-Saharan Africa increased 76%. So that's the surprise for many people, that in fact, if we just look at those first 15 years, that sub-Saharan Africa has performed particularly well. Now, it's a fair comment to say that in the case of Asia, it was mainly intensification, increasing production of existing land. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, it's a combination of land area expansion and intensification. Both factors are important, but probably going forward, in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, more effort will be made with the intensification of existing land in order to conserve the existing natural ecosystems that are there on the continent. The second component that I mentioned, market infrastructure, the importance of roads, of rail, of other transportation systems, connecting farmers to markets, making it possible for farmers to generate food and other agricultural commodities that can meet the requirements of a rapidly urbanizing population. I mentioned before the importance of post-harvest stewardship. We need to cut our losses and our food waste. And you can see here that 1/3 of all food that is produced is lost or wasted at some point along the food value chain. It's obscured by my photograph there, but post-harvest food losses, that these are the losses up to, but not including the retail stage. It adds up to 14%, and post-harvest food waste, which is waste at the retail in various services like hospitals and schools and so on, and in household waste, that adds up to about 17%. So it's different for different commodities, different countries, and the like. But overall, I think the statistic is shocking that we see 1/3 of food disappearing, exiting from the food value chain. And it's great that one of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 12, has a target related to food waste and food losses. So that's 12.3, focusing on halving per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reducing food losses across the value chain. The fourth area of the big five is the convergence on healthy diets. And that really takes into account the idea that really we have, as I said before, 4 billion out of 8 billion are consuming a less than healthy diet. So we have undernutrition and overnutrition. We need convergence around healthy diets, healthy and sustainable diets, filling the nutrient gaps for those who are undernourished and reducing the excess intake of those of us who are overnourished. Then finally, the fifth area is social protection. Social protection covers a lot of areas, including the humanitarian support of the type illustrated through this photograph, but social protection also includes school meal programs. Social protection includes various kinds of voucher programs that are directed towards people who do not have the economic capability, or maybe not even the physical capability, to be able to access a healthy diet. So social protection, it actually contributes to around 1.5 billion people on the planet to achieve their food security. So all of these 5 areas together, sustainable intensification, market, connecting farmers to markets, reducing the losses, healthy diets, social protection, these 5 areas, they need to be considered in a holistic, coherent, integrated way. And very context specific. So the strategy for universal food security in Malawi will be very different from the strategy of universal food security for the city of Tokyo, right? So depending on the context, different aspects, different technologies, different policies will be relevant, but those big 5, I think, are a great place to start. The cross-cutting issues relate to good governance, gender and social inclusion, addressing areas of conflict, and wider health and educational issues are there as well. But those big 5, I believe, are a great place to start. Look, there are many big challenges and opportunities that I think remain. And unfortunately, I don't have time in my lecture today to go through all of these in detail, but I'm just listing 7 areas of those of you who are interested in the food system and what you can do about it. These are the ones that sort of keep me up at night, that I think about, that we're not making sufficient progress on, including the stunting challenge, the overweight and obesity challenge, the need to integrate emergency assistance and development. We tend to have them in separate silos operating in by different organizations and not very well integrated. And I think the big one that all of us are thinking about now is what role for artificial intelligence for food systems transformation. I think there are some incredible opportunities to harness technology from artificial intelligence to address these in all of those big 5 areas that I mentioned earlier. So part 4, very briefly, what does it all take? Strategies are great, right? It's great to have a strategy, the big 5, but it's just not going to happen on its own. It doesn't happen spontaneously. Intensification, sustainable intensification, people don't change their diets spontaneously. It requires different levels of engagement, from international to country level down to local level. It absolutely requires much more than simply the governments. It requires not just the public sector. It doesn't just require international organizations. The private sector, the business sector has to be part of this. They have to be at the table. Third sector, NGOs, philanthropies, foundations and the like have to be part of this process. And higher education sector, universities and colleges like Tokyo Metropolitan University, you have to be a part of this. You have to be part of this. You have to bring ideas and you have to prepare people to be part of all this. And individuals like you and me need to act as well in ways that will really make a difference and can make this transformation take place. Radical financial innovation is needed. There's a lot of discussions going on right now around the world about are our financial institutions, particularly our multilateral development banks, are they fit for purpose? Are they well positioned to be able to address issues like food security and sustainable development and climate change? At the end of the day, after I'd been looking at this for 4 years, working on this book, it struck me that the real difference is leadership. It's our leaders have to be the triggers of change. Leaders through bringing about changes in governance and policies and finance and building capacity and innovating and negotiating and communicating, all these skill sets that are needed by leaders at all levels, right? Leaders of countries, big agencies and the like, but leaders all the way down to our communities and our schools that need to be taking these kinds of actions that could transform the food system. So at the end of my book, I basically have a theory of change that really starts with the education and development of practitioner leaders, people who are interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral and practice-oriented, like the students I've been teaching for the last 15 years or so at Columbia University, who I hope will be able to move inside of these public sector organizations, private sector organizations, third sector organizations and the like, and bring about the changes across the big 5 and lead us to universal food security. So a few final thoughts, pieces of advice, if you like. Set ambitious goals. We do not have time to be incremental at this point. Set ambitious, big, bold goals. Commit to becoming better informed. There is so much misinformation, disinformation out there that you need to work hard at understanding science, at piecing through the evidence, getting past the rhetoric, and really getting a better sense of not just the problem, but also what are the solutions. In all of this implementation, you need to reach out and build sometimes unlikely alliances. I have some friends who work in public sector organizations and NGOs and the like said, no, I never want to work with the private sector. I don't want to deal with the private sector. I have business people I speak to who said, I'm not working with governments. They're corrupt. They're bureaucratic. And I just want to work with business people. Look, I think we all have to find ways of working together and building these unlikely alliances. And universities, again, have to be part of that. Universities are often accused of being, well, just too up in the clouds and ivory tower and academic. But universities need to get out and engage in practice through their professors and through their students as well. Look for blended solutions. There's not single silver bullet solutions to all of these things. In the world that I work in agriculture, you're either agroecology or you're industrial agriculture. You're on these extremes. You're either organic farming or you're GMO farming. Now, look, there are all kinds of opportunities where there are blended solutions. Let's focus on the outcome. Let's focus on what we're looking for. Let's focus on universal food security, healthy people, healthy diets, healthy food systems, okay? And that will require blended solutions. And be, like me, a pragmatic optimist. I am an optimist. I am positive about the future, but I'm also pragmatic. I'm very practical and realistic about these things. Okay, finally, what can an individual do? So we're all part of institutions, right? But most of us are anyway. But what can an individual do? Well, for a start, you can hold your politicians accountable. You can provide electoral and financial support to individuals and political parties who are in favor of and thoughtful and making a real effort towards universal food security and sustainable development. You can modify your own buying and consumption decisions. You can cut your own food waste. That's a great place to start. You can volunteer and work and support third sector organizations, NGOs, charities, foundations, and the like. Do a much better job of educating yourself and becoming better informed and becoming a more effective agent of transformation. And for those of you who are listening, who are in an early stage of your process of choosing a career, seriously think about a career in universal food security, in wherever it is. You might say, I want to be in government, I want to be in the UN, I want to be in the private sector, I want my own social enterprise. Look, there's a place for all of these in the food system. And if you're interested in any of those areas, I think there are great opportunities for and very rewarding careers that can be obtained working on food security issues, whether in the agriculture, in the food processing and that side of things, right through to working directly with consumers. It's a huge, complex, diverse ecosystem, and there's plenty of room for improvement for the foreseeable future. Okay, that brings me to an end. This is the end of this talk. Excuse me. So I tried to summarize a lot of the ideas that I covered in my book, Universal Food Security. Normally at this point, I would really welcome questions and discussions from you. Normally lots of hands go up, and that's the fun part of it. It's not the format for today's talk, however, so I won't be able to do that. But if you wished, feel free to reach out to me. My email is there, gd2147@columbia.edu. I certainly, welcome questions and interactions from folks all over the world. So at this point, let me just stop share. And that's in a nutshell. I hope I've been able to cover some areas that are of interest to you. Thanks again. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this amazing lecture series. I would, as I said, I'd much rather be with you in Tokyo at this time, be able to engage with you. And that's, as I said, that's the fun part of it, because it's a really important topic. and I learn a lot from interacting with folks who are really interested in food security. Finally, let me thank the Tokyo Metropolitan University for giving me this opportunity to speak as part of the global lecture series. And so again, have a wonderful day, and goodbye for now.